Volume 2, Section 12 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 2, Section 12, Chapter 9. Immediately after the republication of her sister's book, she went to Miss Martineau's. I can write to you now, dear E., for I am away from home, and relieved, temporarily at least, by change of air and scene, from the heavy burden of depression which I confess has for nearly 3 months been sinking me to the earth. I never shall forget last autumn. Some days and nights have been cruel, but now, having once told you this, I need say no more on the subject. My loathing of solitude grew extreme. My recollection of my sister is intolerably poignant. I am better now. I am at Miss Martineau's for a week. Her house is very pleasant, both within and without, arranged at all points, with admirable neatness and comfort. Her visitors enjoy the most perfect liberty. What she claims for herself she allows them. I rise at my own hour, breakfast alone. She is up at 5, takes a cold bath and a walk by starlight, and has finished breakfast and got to her work by 7 o'clock. I pass the morning in the drawing-room, she in her study. At 2 o'clock we meet, work, talk, and walk together till 5, her dinner hour. Spend the evening together, when she converses fluently and abundantly, and with the most complete frankness. I go to my own room soon after 10. She sits up, writing letters, till 12. She appears exhaustless in strength and spirits, and indefatigable in the faculty of labour. She is a great and a good woman, of course not without peculiarities, but I have seen none as yet that annoy me. She is both hard and warm-hearted, abrupt and affectionate, liberal and despotic. I believe she is not at all conscious of her own absolutism. When I tell her of it, she denies the charge warmly. Then I laugh at her. I believe she almost rules Ambleside. Some of the gentry dislike her, but the lower orders have a great regard for her. I thought I should like to spend 2 or 3 days with you before going home, so if it is not inconvenient to you, I will. D.V. Come on Monday, and stay till Thursday. I have truly enjoyed my visit here. I have seen a good many people, and all have been so marvellously kind. Not the least so the family of Dr. Arnold. Miss Martineau I relish inexpressibly. Miss Brontë paid the visit she here proposes to her friend, but only remained 2 or 3 days. She then returned home, and immediately began to suffer from her old enemy, sickly and depressing headache. This was all the more trying to bear, as she was obliged to take an active share in the household work, one servant being ill in bed, and the other, Tabby, aged upwards of 80. This visit to Ambleside did Miss Brontë much good, and gave her a stock of pleasant recollections, and fresh interests, to dwell upon in her solitary life. There are many references in her letters to Miss Martineau's character and kindness. She is certainly a woman of wonderful endowments, both intellectual and physical, and though I share few of her opinions, and regard her as fallible on certain points of judgment, I must still award her my sincerest esteem. The manner in which she combines the highest mental culture with the nicest discharge of feminine duties filled me with admiration, while her affectionate kindness earned my gratitude. I think her good and noble qualities far outweigh her defects. It is my habit to consider the individual apart from his or her reputation, practice independent of theory, natural disposition isolated from acquired opinions. Harriet Martineau's person, practice, and character inspire me with the truest affection and respect. You ask me whether Miss Martineau made me a convert to mesmerism? Scarcely, yet I heard miracles of its efficacy, and could hardly discredit the whole of what was told me. I even underwent a personal experiment, and though the result was not absolutely clear, it was inferred that in time I should prove an excellent subject. The question of mesmerism will be discussed with little reserve, I believe, in a forthcoming work of Miss Martineau's, and I have some painful anticipations of the manner in which other subjects, offering less legitimate ground for speculation, will be handled. Your last letter evinced such a sincere and discriminating admiration for Dr. Arnold, that perhaps you will not be wholly uninterested in hearing that, during my late visit to Miss Martineau, I saw much more of Fox How and its inmates, and daily admired, in the widow and children of one of the greatest and best men of his time, the possession of qualities the most estimable and endearing. Of my kind hostess herself I cannot speak in terms too high. Without being able to share all her opinions, philosophical, political, or religious, without adopting her theories, I yet find a worth and greatness in herself, and a consistency, benevolence, perseverance in her practice, such as wins the sincerest esteem and affection. She is not a person to be judged by her writings alone, but rather by her own deeds and life, than which nothing can be more exemplary or nobler. She seems to me the benefactress of Ambleside, yet takes no sort of credit to herself for her active and indefatigable philanthropy. The government of her household is admirably administered. All she does is well done, from the writing of a history down to the quietest female occupation. No sort of carelessness or neglect is allowed under her rule, and yet she is not over strict, nor too rigidly exacting. Her servants and her poor neighbours love as well as respect her. I must not, however, fall into the error of talking too much about her merely because my own mind is just now deeply impressed with what I have seen of her intellectual power and moral worth. Faults she has, but to me they appear very trivial weighed in the balance against her excellencies. Your account of Mr. A. tallies exactly with Miss M.'s. She, too, said that placidity and mildness, rather than originality and power, were his external characteristics. She described him as a combination of the antique Greek sage with the European modern man of science. Perhaps it was mere perversity in me to get the notion that torpid veins and a cold, slow-beating heart lay under his marble outside. But he is a materialist. He serenely denies us our hope of immortality, and quietly blots from man's future heaven and the life to come. That is why a savour of bitterness seasoned my feeling towards him. All you say of Mr. Thackeray is most graphic and characteristic. He stirs in me both sorrow and anger. Why should he lead so harassing a life? Why should his mocking tongue so perversely deny the better feelings of his better moods? For some time, whenever she was well enough in health and spirits, she had been employing herself upon Villette, but she was frequently unable to write, and was both grieved and angry with herself for her inability. In February she writes as follows to Mr. Smith: "Something you say about going to London, but the words are dreamy, and fortunately I am not obliged to hear or answer them. London in summer are many months away. Our moors are all white with snow just now, and little redbreasts come every morning to the window for crumbs. One can lay no plans 3 or 4 months beforehand. Besides, I don't deserve to go to London. Nobody merits a change or a treat less. I secretly think, on the contrary, I ought to be put in prison, and kept on bread and water in solitary confinement, without even a letter from Cornhill, till I had written a book. One of two things would certainly result from such a mode of treatment, pursued for 12 months. Either I should come out at the end of that time with a 3-volume MS. in my hand, or else with a condition of intellect that would exempt me, ever after, from literary efforts and expectations. Meanwhile she was disturbed and distressed by the publication of Miss Martineau's letters, etc. They came down with a peculiar force and heaviness upon a heart that looked, with fond and earnest faith, to a future life as to the meeting place with those who were loved and lost awhile. February 11th, 1851. My dear Sir, have you yet read Miss Martineau's and Mr. Atkinson's new work, Letters on the Nature and Development of Man? If you have not, it would be worth your while to do so. Of the impression this book has made on me, I will not now say much. It is the first exposition of avowed atheism and materialism I have ever read, the first unequivocal declaration of disbelief in the existence of a God, or a future life, I have ever seen. In judging of such exposition and declaration, one would wish entirely to put aside the sort of instinctive horror they awaken, and to consider them in an impartial spirit and collected mood. This I find it difficult to do. The strangest thing is, that we are called on to rejoice over this hopeless blank, to receive this bitter bereavement as great gain, to welcome this unutterable desolation as a state of pleasant freedom. Who could do this if he would? Who would do it if he could? Sincerely, for my own part, do I wish to find and know the truth. But if this be the truth, well may she guard herself with mysteries, and cover herself with a veil. If this be truth, man or woman who beholds her can but curse the day he or she was born. I said, however, I would not dwell on what I thought. I wish to hear rather what some other person thinks, some one whose feelings are unapt to bias his judgment. Read the book, then, in an unprejudiced spirit, and candidly say what you think of it. I mean, of course, if you have time, not otherwise. And yet she could not bear the contemptuous tone in which this work was spoken of by many critics. It made her more indignant than almost any other circumstance during my acquaintance with her. Much as she regretted the publication of the book, she could not see that it had given any one a right to sneer at an action certainly prompted by no worldly motive, and which was but one error, the gravity of which she admitted, in the conduct of a person who had, all her life long, been striving, by deep thought and noble words, to serve her kind. Your remarks on Miss Martineau and her book pleased me greatly, from their tone and spirit. I have even taken the liberty of transcribing for her benefit one or two phrases, because I know they will cheer her. She likes sympathy and appreciation, as all people do who deserve them. And most fully do I agree with you in the dislike you express of that hard, contemptuous tone in which her work is spoken of by many critics. Before I return from the literary opinions of the author to the domestic interests of the woman, I must copy out what she felt and thought about the stones of Venice. The stones of Venice seem nobly laid and chiselled. How grandly the quarry of vast marbles is disclosed! Mr. Ruskin seems to me one of the few genuine writers, as distinguished from bookmakers, of this age. His earnestness even amuses me in certain passages, for I cannot help laughing to think how utilitarians will fume and fret over his deep, serious, and, as they will think, fanatical reverence for art. That pure and severe mind you ascribe to him speaks in every line. He writes like a consecrated priest of the abstract and ideal. I shall bring with me the stones of Venice, all the foundations of marble and of granite, together with the mighty quarry of which they were hewn, and into the bargain a small assortment of crotchets and dicta, the private property of one John Ruskin, Esquire. As spring drew on, the depression of spirits to which she was subject began to grasp her again, and to crush her with a day and nightmare. She became afraid of sinking as low as she had done in the autumn, and to avoid this she prevailed on her old friend and schoolfellow to come and stay with her for a few weeks in March. She found great benefit from this companionship, both from the congenial society in itself, and from the self-restraint of thought imposed by the necessity of entertaining her and looking after her comfort. On this occasion, Miss Brontë said, it will not do to get into the habit off from home, and thus temporarily evading and running away oppression instead of facing, wrestling with, and conquering it, or being conquered by it. I shall now make an extract from one of her letters, which is purposely displaced as to time. I quote it because it relates to a third offer of marriage which she had, and because I find that some are apt to imagine, from the extraordinary power with which she represented the passion of love in her novels, that she herself was easily susceptible of it. Could I ever feel enough to accept of him as a husband? Friendship, gratitude, esteem, I have, but each moment he came near me, and that I could see his eyes fastened on me, my veins ran ice. Now that he is away, I feel far more gently towards him. It is only close by that I grow rigid, stiffening with a strange mixture of apprehension and anger, which nothing softens but his retreat, and a perfect subduing of his manner. I did not want to be proud, nor intend to be proud, but I was forced to be so. Most true it is that we are overruled by one above us, that in his hands our very will is as clay in the hands of the potter. I have now named all the offers of marriage she ever received, until that was made which she finally accepted. The gentleman referred to in this letter retained so much regard for her as to be her friend to the end of her life, a circumstance to his credit and to hers. Before her friend E. took her departure, Mr. Brontë caught cold, and continued for some weeks much out of health, with an attack of bronchitis. His spirits, too, became much depressed, and all his daughter's efforts were directed towards cheering him. When he grew better, and had regained his previous strength, she resolved to avail herself of an invitation which she had received some time before, to pay a visit in London. This year, 1851, was, as every one remembers, the time of the Great Exhibition, but even with that attraction in prospect, she did not intend to stay there long, and, as usual, she made an agreement with her friends, before finally accepting their offered hospitality, that her sojourn at their house was to be as quiet as ever, since any other way of proceeding disagreed with her both mentally and physically. She never looked excited except for a moment, when something in conversation called her out, but she often felt so, even about comparative trifles, and the exhaustion of reaction was sure to follow. Under such circumstances, she always became extremely thin and haggard, yet she averred that the change invariably did her good afterwards. Her preparations in the way of dress for this visit, in the gay time of that gay season, were singularly in accordance with her feminine taste. Quietly anxious to satisfy her love for modest, dainty, neat attire, and not regardless of the becoming, yet remembering consistency, both with her general appearance and with her means, in every selection she made. By the by, I meant to ask you, when you went to Leeds, to do a small errand for me, but fear your hands will be too full of business. It was merely this: in case you chance to be in any shop where the lace cloaks, both black and white, of which I spoke, were sold, to ask their price. I suppose they would hardly like to send a few to Haworth to be looked at. Indeed, if they cost very much, it would be useless; but if they are reasonable, and they would send them, I should like to see them. And also some chemisettes of small size, the full woman's size don't fit me, both of simple style for every day, and good quality for best. It appears I could not rest satisfied when I was well off. I told you I had taken one of the black lace mantles, but when I came to try it with the black satin dress with which I should chiefly want to wear it, I found the effect was far from good. The beauty of the lace was lost, and it looked somewhat brown and rusty. I wrote to Mr. requesting him to change it for a white mantle of the same price. He was extremely courteous, and sent to London for one, which I have got this morning. The price is less, being but £1 14s. It is pretty, neat, and light, looks well on black, and upon reasoning the matter over, I came to the philosophic conclusion that it would be no shame for a person of my means to wear a cheaper thing, so I think I shall take it, and if you ever see it and call it trumpery, so much the worse. Do you know that I was in Leeds on the very same day with you, last Wednesday? I had thought of telling you where I was going, and having your help and company in buying a bonnet, etc. But then I reflected this would merely be making a selfish use of you, so I determined to manage or mismanage the matter alone. I went to Hurst and Hall's for the bonnet, and got one which seemed grave and quiet there amongst all the splendours, but now it looks infinitely too gay with its pink lining. I saw some beautiful silks of pale sweet colours, but had not the spirit nor the means to launch out at the rate of 5 shillings per yard, and went and bought a black silk at 3 shillings after all. I rather regret this, because papa says he would have lent me a sovereign if he had known. I believe, if you had been there, you would have forced me to get into debt. I really can no more come to be, before I go to London, than I can fly. I have quantities of sewing to do, as well as household matters to arrange, before I leave, as they will clean, etc., in my absence. Besides, I am grievously afflicted with headache, which I trust to change of air for relieving. But, meantime, as it proceeds from the stomach, it makes me very thin and grey. Neither you nor anybody else would fatten me up or put me into good condition for the visit. It is fated otherwise. No matter. Calm your passion, yet I am glad to see it. Such spirit seems to prove health. Good-bye, in haste. Your poor mother is like Tabby, Martha, and papa. All these fancy I am somehow, by some mysterious process, to be married in London, or to engage myself to matrimony. How I smile internally! How groundless and improbable is the idea! Papa seriously told me yesterday that if I married and left him, he should give up housekeeping and go into lodgings. I copy the following for the sake of the few words describing the appearance of the heathery moors in late summer. To Sidney Dobell, Esquire. May 24th, 1851. My dear Sir, I hasten to send Mrs. Dobell the autograph. It was the word album that frightened me. I thought she wished me to write a sonnet on purpose for it, which I could not do. Your proposal respecting a journey to Switzerland is deeply kind. It draws me with the force of a mighty temptation, but the stern impossible holds me back. No, I cannot go to Switzerland this summer. Why did the editor of the Eclectic erase that most powerful and pictorial passage? He could not be insensible to its beauty. Perhaps he thought it profane. Poor man! I know nothing of such an orchard country as you describe. I have never seen such a region. Our hills only confess the coming of summer by growing green with young fern and moss, in secret little hollows. Their bloom is reserved for autumn. Then they burn with a kind of dark glow, different, doubtless, from the blush of garden blossoms. About the close of next month I expect to go to London, to pay a brief and quiet visit. I fear chance will not be so propitious as to bring you to town while I am there. Otherwise, how glad I should be if you would call. With kind regards to Mrs. Dobell, believe me, sincerely yours, C. Brontë. Her next letter is dated from London, June 2nd. I came here on Wednesday, being summoned a day sooner than I expected, in order to be in time for Thackeray's second lecture, which was delivered on Thursday afternoon. This, as you may suppose, was a genuine treat to me, and I was glad not to miss it. It was given in Willis's Rooms, where the Almack's balls are held, a great painted and gilded saloon, with long sofas for benches. The audience was said to be the cream of London society, and it looked so. I did not at all expect the great lecturer would know me or notice me under these circumstances, with admiring duchesses and countesses seated in rows before him. But he met me as I entered, shook hands, took me to his mother, whom I had not before seen, and introduced me. She is a fine, handsome, young-looking old lady, was very gracious, and called with one of her granddaughters next day. Thackeray called too, separately. I had a long talk with him, and I think he knows me now a little better than he did. But of this I cannot yet be sure. He is a great and strange man. There is quite a furor for his lectures. They are a sort of essays, characterized by his own peculiar originality and power, and delivered with a finished taste and ease, which is felt but cannot be described. Just before the lecture began, somebody came behind me, leaned over, and said, "Permit me, as a Yorkshire man, to introduce myself." I turned round, saw a strange, not handsome face, which puzzled me for half a minute, and then I said, "You are Lord Carlisle." He nodded and smiled. He talked a few minutes very pleasantly and courteously. Afterwards came another man with the same plea, that he was a Yorkshire man, and this turned out to be Mr. Monckton Milnes. Then came Dr. Forbes, whom I was sincerely glad to see. On Friday I went to the Crystal Palace. It is a marvellous, stirring, bewildering sight, a mixture of a genie palace and a mighty bazaar, but it is not much in my way. I like the lecture better. On Saturday I saw the exhibition at Somerset House. About half a dozen of the pictures are good and interesting, the rest of little worth. Sunday, yesterday, was a day to be marked with a white stone. Through most of the day I was very happy, without being tired or over excited. In the afternoon I went to hear D'Aubion, the great Protestant French preacher. It was pleasant, half sweet, half sad, and strangely suggestive to hear the French language once more. For health, I have so far got on very fairly, considering that I came here far from well. The lady who accompanied Miss Brontë to the lecture at Thackeray's alluded to, says that, soon after they had taken their places, she was aware that he was pointing out her companion to several of his friends, but she hoped that Miss Brontë herself would not perceive it. After some time, however, during which many heads had been turned round, and many glasses put up, in order to look at the author of Jane Eyre, Miss Brontë said, "I am afraid Mr. Thackeray has been playing me a trick." But she soon became too much absorbed in the lecture to notice the attention which was being paid to her, except when it was directly offered, as in the case of Lord Carlisle and Mr. Monckton Milnes. When the lecture was ended, Mr. Thackeray came down from the platform, and making his way towards her, asked her for her opinion. This she mentioned to me not many days afterwards, adding remarks almost identical with those which I subsequently read in Villette, where similar action on the part of Monsieur Paul Emanuel is related. As our party left the hall, he stood at the entrance. He saw and knew me, and lifted his hat. He offered his hand in passing, and uttered the words, "Qu'en dites-vous?" question eminently characteristic, and reminding me, even in this his moment of triumph, of that inquisitive restlessness, that absence of what I considered desirable self-control, which were amongst his faults. He should not have cared just then to ask what I thought, or what anybody thought, but he did care, and he was too natural to conceal, too impulsive to repress his wish. Well, if I blamed his over-eagerness, I liked his naivete. I would have praised him, I had plenty of praise in my heart, but alas! I no words on my lips. who has words at the right moment. I stammered some lame expressions, but was truly glad when other people, coming up with profuse congratulations, covered my deficiency by their redundancy. As they were preparing to leave the room, her companion saw with dismay that many of the audience were forming themselves into two lines, on each side of the aisle, down which they had to pass before reaching the door. Aware that any delay would only make the ordeal more trying, her friend took Miss Brontë's arm in hers, and they went along the avenue of eager and admiring faces. During this passage through the cream of society, Miss Brontë's hand trembled to such a degree that her companion feared lest she should turn faint and be able to proceed, and she dared not express her sympathy to try to give her strength by any touch or word, lest it might bring on the crisis she dreaded. Surely such thoughtless manifestation of curiosity is a blot on the scutcheon of true politeness. The rest of the account of this, her longest visit to London, shall be told in her own words. I sit down to write to you this morning in an inexpressibly flat state, having spent the whole of yesterday and the day before in a gradually increasing headache, which grew at last rampant and violent, ended with excessive sickness, and this morning I am quite weak and washy. I hoped to leave my headaches behind me at Haworth, but it seems I brought them carefully packed in my trunk, and very much have they been in my way since I came. Since I wrote last, I have seen various things worth describing. Rachel, the great French actress, amongst the number. But to-day I really have no pith for the task. I can only wish you good-bye with all my heart. I cannot boast that London has agreed with me well this time. The oppression of frequent headache, sickness, and a low tone of spirits, has poisoned many moments which might otherwise have been pleasant. Sometimes I have felt this hard, and been tempted to murmur at fate, which compels me to comparative silence and solitude for 11 months in the year, and in the 12th, while offering social enjoyment, takes away the vigour and cheerfulness which should turn it to account. But circumstances are ordered for us, and we must submit. Your letter would have been answered yesterday, but I was already gone out before post time, and was out all day. People are very kind, and perhaps I shall be glad of what I have seen afterwards, but it is often a little trying at the time. On Thursday, the Marquis of Westminster asked me to a great party, to which I was to go with Mrs. D., a beautiful, and, I think, a kind woman too; but this I resolutely declined. On Friday, I dined at the and met Mrs. D. and Mr. Monckton Milnes. On Saturday I went to hear and see Rachel, a wonderful sight, terrible as if in the earth had cracked deep at your feet, and revealed a glimpse of hell. I shall never forget it. She made me shudder to the marrow of my bones. In her some fiend has certainly taken up an incarnate home. She is not a woman, she is a snake, she is the... On Sunday, I went to the Spanish Ambassador's chapel, where Cardinal Wiseman, in his archiepiscopal robes and mitre, held a confirmation. The whole scene was impiously theatrical. Yesterday, Monday, I was sent for at 10 to breakfast with Mr. Rogers, the patriarch poet. Mrs. D. and Lord Glenelg were there. No one else. This certainly proved a most calm, refined, and intellectual treat. After breakfast, Sir David Brewster came to take us to the Crystal Palace. I had rather dreaded this, for Sir David is a man of profoundest science, and I feared it would be impossible to understand his explanations of the mechanism, etc. Indeed, I hardly knew how to ask him questions. I was spared all trouble. Without being questioned, he gave information in the kindest and simplest manner. After 2 hours spent at the exhibition, and where, as you may suppose, I was very tired, we had to go to Lord Westminster's, and spend 2 hours more in looking at the collection of pictures in his splendid gallery. To another friend she writes: "May have told you that I have spent a month in London this summer. When you come, you shall ask what questions you like on that point, and I will answer to the best of my stammering ability. Do not press me much on the subject of the Crystal Palace. I went there 5 times, and certainly saw some interesting things, and the coup d'oeil is striking and bewildering enough, but I never was able to get any raptures on the subject, and each renewed visit was made under coercion rather than my own free will. It is an excessively bustling place, and, after all, its wonders appeal too exclusively to the eye, and rarely touch the heart or head. I make an exception to the last assertion, in favour of those who possess a large range of scientific knowledge. Once I went with Sir David Brewster, and perceived that he looked on objects with other eyes than mine." Miss Brontë returned from London by Manchester, and paid us a visit of a couple of days at the end of June. The weather was so intensely hot, and she herself so much fatigued with her London sight seeing, that we did little but sit indoors, with open windows, and talk. The only thing she made a point of exerting herself to procure was a present for Tabby. It was to be a shawl, or rather a large handkerchief, such as she could pin across her neck and shoulders, in the old-fashioned country manner. Miss Brontë took great pains in seeking out one which she thought would please the old woman. On her arrival at home, she addressed the following letter to the friend with whom she had been staying in London: "Haworth, July 1st, 1851. "My dear Mrs. Smith, once more I am at home, where, I am thankful to say, I found my father very well. The journey to Manchester was a little hot and dusty, but otherwise pleasant enough. The 2 stout gentlemen who filled a portion of the carriage when I got in, quitted it at Rugby, and 2 other ladies and myself had it to ourselves the rest of the way. The visit to Mrs. Gaskell formed a cheering break in the journey. Haworth Parsonage is rather a contrast, yet even Haworth Parsonage does not look gloomy in this bright summer weather. It is somewhat still, but with the windows open I can hear a bird or 2 singing on certain thorn trees in the garden. My father and the servants think me looking better than when I left home, and I certainly feel better myself for the change. You are too much like your son to render it advisable I should say so much about your kindness during my visit. However, one cannot help, like Captain Cuttle, making a note of these matters. Papa says I am to thank you in his name, and offer you his respects, which I do accordingly. With truest regards to all your circle, believe me very sincerely yours, C. Brontë." "July 8th, 1851. "My dear Sir, Thackeray's last lecture must, I think, have been his best. What he says about Sterne is true. His observations on literary men and their social obligations and individual duties seem to me also true and full of mental and moral vigour. The International Copyright Meeting seems to have had but a barren result, judging from the report in the Literary Gazette. I cannot see that Sir E. Bulwer and the rest did anything, nor can I well see what it is in their power to do. The argument brought forward about the damage accruing to American national literature from the present piratical system is a good and sound argument, but I am afraid the publishers, honest men, are not yet mentally prepared to give such reasoning due weight. I should think, that which refers to the injury inflicted upon themselves by an oppressive competition in piracy would influence them more, but I suppose all established matters, be they good or evil, are difficult to change. About the phrenological character I must not say a word. Of your own accord you have found the safest point from which to view it. I will not say, look higher. I think you see the matter as it is desirable we should all see what relates to ourselves. If I had a right to whisper a word of counsel, it should be merely this: whatever your present self may be, Resolve with all your strength of resolution never to degenerate thence. Be jealous of a shadow of falling off. Determine rather to look above that standard, and to strive beyond it. Everybody appreciates certain social properties, and likes his neighbour for possessing them, but perhaps few dwell upon a friend's capacity for the intellectual, or care how this might expand, if there were but facilities allowed for cultivation, and space given for growth. It seems to me that even should such space and facilities be denied by stringent circumstances and a rigid fate, still it should do you good fully to know and tenaciously to remember that you have such a capacity. When other people overwhelm you with acquired knowledge, such as you have not had opportunity, perhaps not application, to gain, derive not pride, but support from the thought. If no new books had ever been written, some of these minds would themselves have remained blank pages. They only take an impression. They were not born with a record of thought on the brain, or an instinct of sensation on the heart. If I had never seen a printed volume, nature would have offered my perceptions a varying picture of a continuous narrative, which, without any other teacher than herself, would have schooled me to knowledge, unsophisticated but genuine. Before I received your last, I had made up my mind to tell you that I should expect no letter for 3 months to come, intending afterwards to extend this abstinence to 6 months, for I am jealous of becoming dependent on this indulgence. You doubtless cannot see why, because you do not live my life. Nor shall I now expect a letter, but since you say that you would like to write now and then, I cannot say never write, without imposing on my real wishes a falsehood which they reject, and doing to them a violence to which they entirely refuse to submit. I can only observe that when it pleases you to write, whether seriously or for a little amusement, your notes, if they come to me, will come where they are welcome. Tell, I will try to cultivate good spirits, as assiduously as she cultivates her geraniums. End of Section 12. To Section 13 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell, Volume 2, Section 13, Chapter 10, Part 1. Soon after she returned home, her friend paid her a visit. While she stayed at Haworth, Miss Brontë wrote the letter from which the following extract is taken. The strong sense and right feeling displayed in it on the subject of friendship sufficiently account for the constancy of affection which Miss Brontë earned from all those who once became her friends. To W. S. Williams, Esquire, July 21st, 1851. I could not help wondering whether Cornhill will ever change for me, as Oxford has changed for you. I have some pleasant associations connected with it now. Will these alter their character some day? Perhaps they may, though I have faith to the contrary, because I think I do not exaggerate my partialities. I think I take faults along with excellencies, blemishes together with beauties. And besides, in the matter of friendship, I have observed that disappointment here arises chiefly, not from liking our friends too well, or thinking of them too highly, but rather from an over-estimate of their liking for and opinion of us; and that if we guard ourselves with sufficient scrupulousness of care from error in this direction, and can be content and even happy to give more affection than we receive, can make just comparison of circumstances, and be severely accurate in drawing inferences thence, and never let self-love blind our eyes, I think we may manage to get through life with consistency and constancy, unembittered by that misanthropy which springs from revulsions of feeling. All this sounds a little metaphysical, but it is good sense if you consider it. The moral of it is, that if we would build on a sure foundation in friendship, we must love our friends for their sakes rather than for our own. We must look at their truth to themselves full as much as their truth to us. In the latter case, every wound to self-love would be a cause of coldness; in the former, only some painful change in the friend's character and disposition, some fearful breach in his allegiance to his better self, could alienate the heart. How interesting your old maiden cousin's gossip about your parents must have been to you, and how gratifying to find that the reminiscence turned on none but pleasant facts and characteristics! Life must indeed be slow in that little decaying hamlet amongst the chalk hills. After all, depend upon it, it is better to be worn out with work in a thronged community than to perish of inaction in a stagnant solitude. Take this truth into consideration whenever you get tired of work and bustle. I received a letter from her a little later than this, and though there is reference throughout to what I must have said in writing to her, all that it called forth in reply is so peculiarly characteristic that I cannot prevail upon myself to pass it over without a few extracts. Haworth, August 6th, 1851. My dear Mrs. Gaskell, I was too much pleased with your letter, when I got it at last, to feel disposed to murmur now about the delay. About a fortnight ago I received a letter from Miss Martineau, also a long letter, and treating precisely the same subjects on which yours dwelt, viz., the Exhibition and Thackeray's last lecture. It was interesting mentally to place the two documents side by side, to study the two aspects of mind, to view alternately the same scene through two mediums. Full striking was the difference, and the more striking because it was not the rough contrast of good and evil, but the more subtle opposition, the more delicate diversity of different kinds of good. The excellences of one nature resembled, I thought, that of some sovereign medicine, harsh perhaps to the taste, but potent to invigorate. The good of the other seemed more akin to the nourishing efficacy of our daily bread. It is not bitter, it is not lusciously sweet, it pleases without flattering the palate, it sustains without forcing the strength. I very much agree with you in all you say. For the sake of variety, I could almost wish that the concord of opinion were less complete. To begin with Trafalgar Square, my taste goes with yours and Meta's completely on this point. I have always thought it a fine sight, and sight also. The view from the summit of those steps has ever struck me as grand and imposing, Nelson column included, the fountains I could dispense with. With respect also to the Crystal Palace, my thoughts are precisely yours. Then I feel sure you speak justly of Thackeray's lecture. You do well to set aside odious comparisons, and to wax impatient of that trite twaddle about nothing newness, a jargon which simply proves, in those who habitually use it, a coarse and feeble faculty of appreciation, an inability to discern the relative value of originality and novelty, a lack of that refined perception which, dispensing with the stimulus of an ever new subject, can derive sufficiency of pleasure from freshness of treatment. To such critics, the prime of a summer morning would bring no delight. Wholly occupied with railing at their cook for not having provided a novel and piquant breakfast dish, they would remain insensible to such influences as lie in sunrise, dew, and breeze. Therein would be nothing new. Is it Mr. family experience which has influenced your feelings about the Catholics? I own I cannot be sorry for this commencing change. Good people, very good people, I doubt not, There are amongst the Romanists, but the system is not one which would have such sympathy as yours. Look at Popery taking off the mask in Naples. I have read the Saint's tragedy. As a work of art, it seems to me far superior to either Alton Locke or Yeast. Faulty it may be, crude and unequal, yet there are portions where some of the deep chords of human nature are swept with a hand which is strong, even while it falters. We see throughout, I think, that Elizabeth has not, and never had, a mind perfectly sane. From the time that she was what she herself, in the exaggeration of her humility, calls an idiot girl, to the hour when she lay moaning in visions on her dying bed, a slight craze runs through her whole existence. This is good, this is true. A sound mind, a healthy intellect, would have dashed the priest's power to the wall, would have defended her natural affections from his grasp, as a lioness defends her young, would have been as true to husband and children as your leal-hearted little Maggie was to her Frank. Only a mind weak with some fatal flaw could have been influenced as was this poor saint's. But what anguish, what struggles! Seldom do I cry over books, but here my eyes rained as I read. When Elizabeth turns her face to the wall, I stopped there, needed no more. Deep truths are touched on in this tragedy, touched on, not fully elicited, truths that stir a peculiar pity, a compassion hot with wrath and bitter with pain. This is no poet's dream. We know that such things have been done, that minds have been thus subjugated, and lives thus laid waste. Remember me kindly and respectfully to Mr. Gaskell, and, though I have not seen Marianne, I must beg to include her in the love I send the others. Could you manage to convey a small kiss to that dear, but dangerous little person, Julia? She surreptitiously possessed herself of a minute fraction of my heart, which has been missing, ever since I saw her. Believe me sincerely and affectionately yours, C. Brontë. The reference which she makes at the end of this letter is to my youngest little girl, between whom and her a strong mutual attraction existed. The child would steal her little hand into Miss Brontë's scarcely larger one, and each took pleasure in this apparently unobserved caress. Yet once, when I told Julia to take and show her the way to some room in the house, Miss Brontë shrunk back. "Do not bid her do anything for me," she said. "It has been so sweet hitherto to have her rendering her little kindnesses spontaneously." As illustrating her feelings with regard to children, I may give what she says ill, another of her letters to me. Whenever I see Florence and Julia again, I shall feel like a fond but bashful suitor, who views at a distance the fair personage to whom, in his clownish awe, he dare not risk a near approach. Such is the clearest idea I can give you of my feelings towards children I like, but to whom I am a stranger. And to what children am I not a stranger? They seem to me little wonders. Their talk, their ways are all matter of half admiring, half puzzled speculation. The following is part of a long letter which I received from her, dated September 20th, 1851. Beautiful are those sentences out of James Martineau's sermons, some of them gems most pure and genuine, ideas deeply conceived, finely expressed. I should like much to see his review of his sister's book. Of all the articles respecting which you question me, I have seen none, except that notable one in the Westminster, on the emancipation of women. But why are you and I to think, perhaps I should rather say to feel, so exactly alike on some points that there can be no discussion between us? Your words on this paper express my thoughts. Well argued it is, clear, logical, but vast is the hiatus of omission, harsh the consequent jar on every finer chord of the soul. What is this hiatus? I think I know, and knowing, I will venture to say. I think the writer forgets there is such a thing as self-sacrificing love and disinterested devotion. When I first read the paper, I thought it was the work of a powerful-minded, clear-headed woman, who had a hard, jealous heart, muscles of iron, and nerves of bend leather; of a woman who longed for power, and had never felt affection. Reader's note: Bend, in Yorkshire, is strong ox leather. To many women affection is sweet, and power conquered indifferent, though we all like influence won. I believe J.S. Mill would make a hard, dry, dismal world of it. And yet he speaks admirable sense through a great portion of his article, especially when he says that if there be a natural unfitness in women for men's employment, there is no need to make laws on the subject. Leave all careers open. Let them try. Those who ought to succeed will succeed, or, at least, will have a fair chance. The incapable will fall back into their right place. He likewise disposes of the maternity question very neatly. In short, J.S. Mill's head is, I dare say, very good, but I feel disposed to scorn his heart. You are right when you say that there is a large margin in human nature over which the logicians have no dominion. Glad am I that it is so. I send by this post Ruskin's Stones of Venice, and I hope you and Meta will find passages in it that will please you. Some parts would be dry and technical were it not for the character, the marked individuality, which pervades every page. I wish Marion had come to speak to me at the lecture. It would have given me such pleasure. What you say of that small sprite, Julia, amuses me much. I believe you don't know that she has a great deal of her mamma's nature, modified, in her. Yet I think you will find she has as she grows up. Will it not be a great mistake if Mr. Thackeray should deliver his lectures at Manchester under such circumstances and conditions as will exclude people like you and Mr. Gaskell from the number of his audience? I thought his London plan too narrow. Charles Dickens would not thus limit his sphere of action. You charge me to write about myself. What can I say on that precious topic? My health is pretty good. My spirits are not always alike. Nothing happens to me. I hope and expect little in this world, and am thankful that I do not despond and suffer more. Thank you for inquiring after our old servant. She is pretty well. The little shawl, etc., pleased her much. Papa likewise, I am glad to say, is pretty well. With his and my kindest regards to you and Mr. Gaskell. Believe me sincerely and affectionately yours, C. Brontë. Before the autumn was far advanced, the usual effects of her solitary life, and of the unhealthy situation of Haworth Parsonage, began to appear in the form of sick headaches and miserable, starting, wakeful nights. She does not dwell on this in her letters, but there is an absence of all cheerfulness of tone, and an occasional sentence forced out of her, which imply far more than many words could say. There was illness all through the parsonage household, taking its accustomed forms of lingering influenza and low fever. She herself was outwardly the strongest of the family, and all domestic exertion fell for a time upon her shoulders. To W. S. Williams, Esquire, September 26th. As I laid down your letter, after reading with interest the graphic account it gives of a very striking scene, I could not help feeling with renewed force a truth, trite enough, yet ever impressive, viz., that it is good to be attracted out of ourselves, to be forced to take a near view of the sufferings, the privations, the efforts, the difficulties of others. If we ourselves live in fullness of content, it is well to be reminded that thousands of our fellow creatures undergo a different lot. It is well to have a sleepy sympathies excited, and lethargic selfishness shaken up. If, on the other hand, we be contending with the special grief, the intimate trial, the peculiar bitterness with which God has seen fit to mingle our own cup of existence, it is very good to know that our overcast lot is not singular. It stills the repining word and thought, it rouses the flagging strength, to have it vividly set before us that there are countless afflictions in the world, each perhaps rivalling, some surpassing, the private pain over which we are too prone exclusively to sorrow. All those crowded immigrants had their troubles, their untoward causes of banishment. You, the looker on, had your wishes and regrets, your anxieties, alloying your home happiness and domestic bliss, and the parallel might be pursued further, and still it would be true, still the same, a thorn in the flesh for each, some burden, some conflict for all. How far this state of things is susceptible of amelioration, from changes in public institutions, alterations in national habits, may and ought to be earnestly considered. But this is a problem not easily solved. The evils, as you point them out, are great, real, and most obvious. The remedy is obscure and vague. Yet for such difficulties as spring from over-competition, immigration must be good. The new life in a new country must give a new lease of hope. The wider field, less thickly peopled, must open a new path for endeavour. But I always think great physical powers of exertion and endurance ought to accompany such a step. I am truly glad to hear that an original writer has fallen in your way. Originality is the pearl of great price in literature, the rarest, the most precious claim by which an author can be recommended. Are not your publishing prospects for the coming season tolerably rich and satisfactory? You inquire after Currer Bell. It seems to me that the absence of his name from your list of announcements will leave no blank, and that he may at least spare himself the disquietude of thinking he is wanted, when it is certainly not his lot to appear. Perhaps Currer Bell has his secret moan about these matters, but if so, he will keep it to himself. It is an affair about which no words need be wasted, for no words can make a change. It is between him and his position, his faculties and his fate. My husband and I were anxious that she should pay us a visit before the winter had set completely in, and she thus wrote, declining our invitation. November 6th. If anybody would tempt me from home, you would, but just now from home I must not, will not go. I feel greatly better at present than I did 3 weeks ago. For a month or 6 weeks about the equinox, autumnal or vernal, is a period of the year which, I have noticed, strangely tries me. Sometimes the strain falls on the mental, sometimes on the physical part of me. I am ill with neuralgic headache, and I am ground to the dust with deep dejection of spirits. Not, however, such dejection but I can keep it to myself. That weary time has, I think and trust, got over for this year. It was the anniversary of my poor brother's death, and of my sister's failing health. I need say no more. As to running away from home every time I have a battle of this sort to fight, it would not do besides. The weird would follow. As to shaking it off, that cannot be. I have declined to go to Miss Martineau, and now I decline to go to you. But listen, do not think that I throw your kindness away, or that it fails of doing the good you desire. On the contrary, the feeling expressed in your letter, proved by your invitation, goes right home, where you would have it go, and heals as you would have it to heal. Your description of Frederica Bremer tallies exactly with one I read somewhere, in I know not what book. I laughed out when I got to the mention of Frederica's special accomplishment, given by you with a distinct simplicity that, to my taste, is what the French would call impayable. Where do you find the foreigner who is without some little drawback of this description? It is a pity." A visit from Miss Wooler at this period did Miss Brontë much good for the time. She speaks of her guest company as being very pleasant, like good wine, both to her father and to herself. But Miss Wooler could not remain with her long, and then again the monotony of her life returned upon her in all its force, the only events of her days and weeks consisting in the small changes which occasionally letters brought. It must be remembered that her health was often such as to prevent her stirring out of the house in inclement or wintry weather. She was liable to sore throat, and depressing pain at the chest, and difficulty of breathing, on the least exposure to cold. A letter from her late visitor touched and gratified her much. It was simply expressive of gratitude for attention and kindness shown to her, but it wound up by saying that she had not for many years experienced so much enjoyment as during the 10 days passed at Haworth. This little sentence called out a wholesome sensation of modest pleasure in Miss Brontë's mind, and she says, "It did me good." I find in a letter to a distant friend, written about this time, a retrospect of her visit to London. It is too ample to be considered as a mere repetition of what she had said before, and besides, it shows that her first impressions of what she saw and heard were not crude and transitory, but stood the test of time and afterthought. "I spent a few weeks in town last summer, as you have heard, and was much interested by many things. I heard and saw there. What now chiefly dwells in my memory are Mr. Thackeray's lectures, Mademoiselle Rachel's acting, D'Aubigne's, Melville's, and Maurice's preaching, and the Crystal Palace. Mr. Thackeray's lectures you will have seen mentioned and commented on in the papers. They were very interesting. I could not always coincide with the sentiments expressed, or the opinions broached, but I admired the gentlemanlike ease, the quiet humour, the taste, the talent, the simplicity, and the originality of the lecturer. Rachel's acting transfixed me with wonder, enchained me with interest, and thrilled me with horror. The tremendous force with which she expresses the very worst passions in their strongest essence forms an exhibition as exciting as the bull-fights of Spain and the gladiatorial combats of old Rome, and, it seemed to me, not one whit more moral than these poisoned stimulants to popular ferocity. It is scarcely human nature that she shows you, it is something wilder and worse, the feelings and fury of a fiend. The great gift of genius she undoubtedly has, but I fear she rather abuses it than turns it to good account. With all the 3 preachers I was greatly pleased. Melville seemed to me the most eloquent, Maurice the most in earnest. Had I the choice, it is Maurice whose ministry I should frequent. On the Crystal Palace I need not comment. You must already have heard too much of it. It struck me at the first with only a vague sort of wonder and admiration, but having one day the privilege of going over it in company with an eminent countryman of yours, Sir David Brewster, and hearing in his friendly Scotch accent his lucid explanation of many things that had been to me before a sealed book, I began a little better to comprehend it, or at least a small part of it. Whether its final results will equal expectation, I know not. Her increasing indisposition subdued her at last, in spite of all her efforts of reason and will. She tried to forget oppressive recollections in writing. Her publishers were importunate for a new book from her. Villette was begun, but she lacked power to continue it. "It is not at all likely," she says, that my book will be ready at the time you mention. If my health is spared, I shall get on with it as fast as is consistent with its being done. If not well, yet as well as I can do it. Not one whit faster. When the mood leaves me, it has left me now, without vouchsafing so much as a word or a message when it will return. I put by the MS., and wait till it comes back again. God knows I sometimes have to wait long, very long, it seems to me. Meantime, if I might make a request to you, it would be this. Please to say nothing about my book till it is written, and in your hands. You may not like it. I am not myself elated with it as far as it is gone; and authors, you need not be told, are always tenderly indulgent, even blindly partial to their own. Even if it should turn out reasonably well, still I regard it as ruin to the prosperity of an ephemeral book like a novel, to be much talked of beforehand, as if it were something great. People are apt to conceive, or at least to profess, exaggerated expectation, such as no performance can realize. Then ensue disappointment, and the due revenge, detraction, and failure. If when I write I were to think of the critics who, I know, are waiting for Currer Bell, ready to break all his bones or ever he comes to the bottom of the den, my hand would fall paralysed on my desk. However, I can do my best, and then muffle my head in the mantle of patience, and sit down at her feet and wait. The mood here spoken of did not go off. It had a physical origin. Indigestion, nausea, headache, sleeplessness, all combined to produce miserable depression of spirits. A little event which occurred about this time did not tend to cheer her. It was the death of poor old faithful keeper, Emily's dog. He had come to the parsonage in the fierce strength of his youth. Sullen and ferocious, he had met with his master in the indomitable Emily. Like most dogs of his kind, he feared, respected, and deeply loved her who subdued him. He had mourned her with the pathetic fidelity of his nature, falling into old age after her death; and now her surviving sister wrote, "Poor old keeper died last Monday morning, after being ill one night. He went gently to sleep. We laid his old faithful head in the garden. Flossy, the fat curly-haired dog, is dull, and misses him. There was something very sad in losing the old dog, yet I am glad he met a natural fate. People kept thinking he ought to be put away, which neither papa nor I like to think of." End of Chapter 10, Part 1. End of Section 13. Section 14 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë, by Elizabeth Gaskell, Volume 2, Section 14, Chapter 10, Part 2. When Miss Brontë wrote this, on December 8th, she was suffering from a bad cold, and pain in her side. Her illness increased, and on December 17th, she, so patient, silent, and enduring of suffering, so afraid of any unselfish taxing of others, had to call to her friend for help. "I cannot at present go to see you, but I would be grateful if you could come and see me, even were it only for a few days. To speak truth, I have put on but a poor time of it during this month past. I kept hoping to be better, but was at last obliged to have recourse to a medical man. Sometimes I felt very weak and low, and longed much for society, but could not persuade myself to commit the selfish act of asking you, merely for my own relief. The doctor speaks encouragingly, but as yet I get no better. As the illness has been coming on for a long time, it cannot, I suppose, be expected to disappear all at once. I am not confined to bed, but I am weak. Have had no appetite for about 3 weeks, and my nights are very bad. I am well aware myself that extreme and continuous depression of spirits has had much to do with the origin of the illness, and I know a little cheerful society would do me more good than gallons of medicine. If you can come, come on Friday. Write to-morrow and say whether this be possible, and what time you will be at Keighley, that I may send the gig. I do not ask you to stay long. A few days is all I request. Of course her friend went, and a certain amount of benefit was derived from her society, always so grateful to Miss Brontë; but the evil was now too deep-rooted to be more than palliated for a time by the little cheerful society for which she so touchingly besought. A relapse came on before long. She was very ill, and the remedies employed took an unusual effect on her peculiar sensitiveness of constitution. Mr. Brontë was miserably anxious about the state of his only remaining child, for she was reduced to the last degree of weakness, as she had been unable to swallow food for above a week before. She rallied, and derived her sole sustenance from half a teacup of liquid, administered by teaspoonfuls, in the course of the day. Yet she kept out of bed, for her father's sake, and struggled in solitary patience through her worst hours. When she was recovering, her spirits needed support, and then she yielded to her friend's entreaty that she would visit her. All the time that Miss Brontë's illness had lasted, Miss had been desirous of coming to her. But she refused to avail herself of this kindness, saying, that it was enough to burden herself, that it would be misery to annoy another, and, even at her worst time, she tells her friend with humorous glee how coolly she had managed to capture one of Miss' letters to Mr. Brontë, which she suspected was of a kind to aggravate his alarm about his daughter's state, and at once conjecturing its tenor, made its contents her own. Happily for all parties, Mr. Brontë was wonderfully well this winter. Good sleep, good spirits, and an excellent steady appetite, all seemed to mark vigour; and in such a state of health, Charlotte could leave him to spend a week with her friend without any great anxiety. She benefited greatly by the kind attentions and cheerful society of the family with whom she went to stay. They did not care for her in the least as Currer Bell, but had known and loved her for years as Charlotte Brontë. To them her invalid weakness was only a fresh claim upon their tender regard, from the solitary woman whom they had first known as a little motherless schoolgirl. Miss Brontë wrote to me about this time, and told me something of what she had suffered. February 6th, 1852. Certainly the past winter has been to me a strange time. Had I the prospect before me of living it over again, my prayer must necessarily be, let this cup pass from me. That depression of spirits, which I thought was gone by when I wrote last, came back again with a heavy recoil. Internal congestion ensued, and then inflammation. I had severe pain in my right side, frequent burning and aching in my chest. Sleep almost forsook me, or would never come, except accompanied by ghastly dreams. Appetite vanished, and slow fever was my continual companion. It was some time before I could bring myself to have recourse to medical advice. I thought my lungs were affected, and could feel no confidence in the power of medicine. When at last, however, a doctor was consulted, he declared my lungs and chest sound, and ascribed all my sufferings to derangement of the liver, on which organ it seems the inflammation had fallen. This information was a great relief to my dear father, as well as to myself; but I had subsequently rather sharp medical discipline to undergo, and was much reduced. Though not yet well, it is with deep thankfulness that I can say I am greatly better. My sleep, appetite, and strength seem all returning. It was a great interest to her to be allowed an early reading of Esmond, and she expressed her thoughts on the subject in a criticizing letter to Mr. Smith, who had given her this privilege. February 14th, 1852. My dear Sir, it has been a great delight to me to read Mr. Thackeray's work, and I so seldom now express my sense of kindness that, for once, you must permit me, without rebuke, to thank you for a pleasure so rare and special. Yet I am not going to praise either Mr. Thackeray or his book. I have read, enjoyed, been interested, and, after all, feel full as much ire and sorrow as gratitude and admiration. And still one can never lay down a book of his without the last two feelings having their part, be the subject or treatment what it may. In the first half of the book, what chiefly struck me was the wonderful manner in which the writer throws himself into the spirit and letters of the times whereof he treats. The allusions, the illustrations, the style, all seem to me so masterly in their exact keeping, their harmonious consistency, their nice, natural truth, their pure exemption from exaggeration. No second-rate imitator can write in that way. No coarse scene-painter can charm us with an illusion so delicate and perfect. But what bitter satire, what relentless dissection of diseased subjects! Well, and this, too, is right, or would be right, if the savage surgeon did not seem so fiercely pleased with his work. Thackeray likes to dissect an ulcer or an aneurism. He has pleasure in putting his cruel knife or probe into quivering, living flesh. Thackeray would not like all the world to be good. No great satirist would like society to be perfect. As usual, he is unjust to women, quite unjust. There is hardly any punishment he does not deserve for making Lady Castlewood peep through a keyhole, listen at a door, and be jealous of a boy and a milkmaid. Many other things I noticed, that, for my part, grieved and exasperated me as I read, but then again came passages so true, so deeply thought, so tenderly felt, one could not help forgiving and admiring. But I wish he could be told not to care much for dwelling on the political or religious intrigues of the times. Thackeray, in his heart, does not value political or religious intrigues of any age or date. He likes to show us human nature at home, as he himself daily sees it. His wonderful observant faculty likes to be in action. In him this faculty is a sort of captain and leader, and if ever any passage in his writings lacks interest, it is when this master faculty is for a time thrust into a subordinate position. I think such is the case in the former half of the present volume. Towards the middle, he throws off restraint, becomes himself, and is strong to the close. Everything now depends on the second and third volumes. If in pith and interest they fall short of the first, a true success cannot ensue. If the continuation be an improvement upon the commencement, if the stream gather force as it rolls, Thackeray will triumph. Some people have been in the habit of terming him the second writer of the day. It just depends on himself whether or not these critics shall be justified in their award. He need not be the second. God made him second to no man. If I were he, I would show myself as I am, not as critics report me. At any rate, I would do my best. Mr. Thackeray is easy and indolent, and seldom cares to do his best. Thank you once more, and believe me, yours sincerely, C. Brontë. Miss Brontë's health continued such that she could not apply herself to writing as she wished, for many weeks after the serious attack from which she had suffered. There was not very much to cheer her in the few events that touched her interest during this time. She heard in March of the death of a friend's relation in the colonies, and we see something of what was the corroding dread at her heart. The news of E.'s death came to me last week in a letter from M. A long letter, which wrung my heart so, in its simple, strong, truthful emotion, I have only ventured to read it once. It ripped up half-scarred wounds with terrible force. The death-bed was just the same, breath failing, etc. She fears she shall now, in her dreary solitude, become a stern, harsh, selfish woman. This fear struck home. Again and again have I felt it for myself, and what is my position to M.'s? May God help her, as God only can help. Again and again her friend urged her to leave home, nor were various invitations wanting to enable her to do this, when these constitutional excesses of low spirits preyed too much upon her in her solitude. But she would not allow herself any such indulgence, unless it became absolutely necessary from the state of her health. She dreaded the perpetual recourse to such stimulants as change of scene and society, because of the reaction that was sure to follow. As far as she could see, her life was ordained to be lonely, and she must subdue her nature to her life, and, if possible, bring the two into harmony. When she could employ herself in fiction, all was comparatively well. The characters were her companions in the quiet hours, which she spent utterly alone, unable often to stir out of doors for many days together. The interest of the persons in her novels supplied the lack of interest in her own life, and memory and imagination found their appropriate work, and ceased to prey upon her vitals. But too frequently she could not write, could not see her people, nor hear them speak. A great mist of headache had blotted them out. They were non-existent to her. This was the case all through the present spring, and, anxious as her publishers were for its completion, Villette stood still. Even her letters to her friend are scarce and brief. Here and there I find a sentence in them which can be extracted, and which is worth preserving. M.'s letter is truly interesting. It shows a mind one cannot but truly admire. Compare its serene trusting strength with poor vacillating dependence. When the letter was in her first burst of happiness, I never remember the feeling finding vent in expressions of gratitude to God. There was always a continued claim upon your sympathy in the mistrust and doubt she felt of her own bliss. M believes, her faith is grateful and at peace, yet while happy in herself, how thoughtful she is for others. March 23rd, 1852. You say, dear E., that you often wish I would chat on paper, as you do. How can I? Where are my materials? Is my life fertile in subjects of chat? What callers do I see? What visits do I pay? No, you must chat, and I must listen, and say yes, and no, and thank you, for 5 minutes' recreation. I am amused at the interest you take in politics. Don't expect to rouse me. To me, all ministries and all oppositions seem to be pretty much alike. Disraeli was factious as leader of the opposition. Lord John Russell is going to be factious, now that he has stepped into Disraeli's shoes. Lord Derby's Christian love and spirit is worth 3 halfpence farthing. To W. S. Williams, Esquire. March 25th, 1852. My dear Sir, Mr. Smith intimated a short time since that he had some thoughts of publishing a reprint of Shirley. Having revised the work, I now enclose the errata. I have likewise sent off to-day, per rail, a return box of Cornhill books. I have lately read with great pleasure The Two Families. This work, it seems, should have reached me in January, but, owing to a mistake, it was detained at the Dead Letter Office, and lay there nearly 2 months. I liked the commencement very much, The clothes seemed to me scarcely equal to Rose Douglas. I thought the authoress committed a mistake in shifting the main interest from the two personages on whom it first rests, viz., Ben Wilson and Mary, to other characters of quite inferior conception. Had she made Ben and Mary her hero and heroine, and continued the development of their fortunes and characters in the same truthful, natural vein in which she commences it, an excellent, even an original book might have been the result. As for Lilias and Ronald, they are mere romantic figments, with nothing of the genuine Scottish peasant about them. They do not even speak the Caledonian dialect. They palaver like a fine lady and a gentleman. I ought long since to have acknowledged the gratification with which I read Miss Kavanagh's Women of Christianity. Her charity and, on the whole, her impartiality are very beautiful. She touches indeed with too gentle a hand the theme of Elizabeth of Hungary, and in her own mind she evidently misconstrues the fact of Protestant charities seeming to be fewer than Catholic. She forgets, or does not know, that Protestantism is a quieter creed than Romanism. As it does not clothe its priesthood in scarlet, so neither does it set up its good women for saints, canonize their names, and proclaim their good works. In the records of man, their almsgiving will not perhaps be found registered, but heaven has its accounts as well as earth. With kind regards to yourself and family, who, I trust, have all safely weathered the rough winter lately past, as well as the east winds, which are still nipping our spring in Yorkshire. I am, my dear sir, yours sincerely, C. Brontë. April 3rd, 1852. My dear Sir, the box arrived quite safely, and I very much thank you for the contents, which are most kindly selected. As you wish me to say what I thought of The School for Fathers, I hasten to read it. The book seems to me clever, interesting, very amusing, and likely to please generally. There is a merit in the choice of ground, which is not yet too hackneyed. The comparative freshness of subject, character, and epoch give the tale a certain attractiveness. There is also, I think, a graphic rendering of situations, and a lively talent for describing whatever is visible and tangible, what the eye meets on the surface of things. The humour appears to me such as would answer well on the stage. Most of the scenes seem to demand dramatic accessories to give them their full effect. But I think one cannot with justice bestow higher praise than this. To speak candidly, I felt, in reading the tale, a wondrous hollowness in the moral and sentiment, a strange dilettante shallowness in the purpose and feeling. After all, Jack is not much better than a Tony Lumpkin, and there is no very great breadth of choice between the clown he is and the fop his father would have made him. The grossly material life of the old English fox hunter, and the frivolous existence of the fine gentleman present extremes, each in its way so repugnant that one feels half inclined to smile when called upon to sentimentalize over the lot of a youth forced to pass from one to the other, torn from the stables to be ushered perhaps into the ball-room. Jack dies mournfully indeed, and you are sorry for the poor fellow's untimely end. But you cannot forget that, if he had not been thrust into the way of Colonel Penruddock's weapon, he might possibly have broken his neck in a fox hunt. The character of Sir Thomas Warren is excellent, consistent throughout. That of Mr. Addison not bad, but sketchy, a mere outline, wanting colour and finish. The man's portrait is there, and his costume, and fragmentary anecdotes of his life, but where is the man's nature, soul, and self? I say nothing about the female characters, not one word, only that Lydia seems to me like a pretty little actress, prettily dressed, gracefully appearing and disappearing, and reappearing in a genteel comedy, assuming the proper sentiments of her part with all due tact and naivete, and that is all. Your description of the model man of business is true enough, I doubt not, but we will not fear that society will ever be brought quite to this standard. Human nature, bad as it is, has, after all, elements that forbid it. But the very tendency to such a consummation, the marked tendency, I fear, of the day, produces no doubt cruel suffering. Yet when the evil of competition passes a certain limit, must it not in time work its own cure? I suppose it will, but then through some convulsed crisis, shattering all around it like an earthquake. Meantime, for how many is life made a struggle, enjoyment and rest curtailed, labour terribly enhanced beyond almost what nature can bear, I often think that this world would be the most terrible of enigmas, were it not for the firm belief that there is a world to come, where conscientious effort and patient pain will meet their reward. Believe me, my dear sir, sincerely yours, C. Brontë. A letter to her old Brussels schoolfellow gives a short retrospect of the dreary winter she had passed through. Haworth, April 12th, 1852. I struggled through the winter, and the early part of the spring, often with great difficulty. My friend stayed with me a few days in the early part of January; she could not be spared longer. I was better during her visit, but had a relapse soon after she left me, which reduced my strength very much. It cannot be denied that the solitude of my position fearfully aggravated its other evils. Some long stormy days and nights there were, when I felt such a craving for support and companionship as I cannot express. Sleepless, I lay awake night after night, weak and unable to occupy myself. I sat at my chair day after day, the saddest memories my only company. It was a time I shall never forget, but God sent it, and it must have been for the best. I am better now, and very grateful do I feel for the restoration of tolerable health. But, as if there was always to be some affliction, Papa, who enjoyed wonderful health during the whole winter, is ailing with his spring attack of bronchitis. I earnestly trust it may pass over in the comparatively ameliorated form in which it has hitherto shown itself. Let me not forget to answer your question about the cataract. Tell your papa that my father was 70 at the time he underwent an operation. He was most reluctant to try the experiment, could not believe that at his age, and with his want of robust strength, it would succeed. I was obliged to be very decided in the matter, and to act entirely on my own responsibility. Nearly 6 years have now elapsed since the cataract was extracted. It was not merely depressed. He has never once during that time regretted the step, and a day seldom passes that he does not express gratitude and pleasure at the restoration of that inestimable privilege of vision, whose loss he once knew. I had given Miss Brontë, in one of my letters, an outline of the story on which I was then engaged, and in reply she says, "The sketch you give of your work, respecting which I am, of course, dumb, seems to me very noble, and its purpose may be as useful in practical result as it is high and just in theoretical tendency. Such a book may restore hope and energy to many who thought they had forfeited their right to both, and open a clear course for honourable effort to some who deemed that they and all honour had parted company in this world. Yet hear my protest. Why should she die? Why are we to shut up the book weeping? My heart fails me already at the thought of the pang it will have to undergo, and yet you must follow the impulses of your own inspiration. If that commands the slaying of the victim, no bystander has a right to put out his hand to stay the sacrificial knife. but I hold you a stern priestess in these matters." As the milder weather came on, her health improved, and her power of writing increased. She set herself with redoubled vigour to the work before her, and denied herself pleasure for the purpose of steady labour. Hence she writes to her friend: "May 11th. Dear E., I must adhere to my resolution of neither visiting nor being visited at present. Stay you quietly at B till you go to S, as I shall stay at Haworth. As sincere a farewell can be taken with the heart as with the lips, and perhaps less painful. I am glad the weather is changed. The return of the south-west wind suits me, but I hope you have no cause to regret the departure of your favourite east wind. What you say about does not surprise me. I have had many little notes, whereof I answer about 1 in 3, breathing the same spirit. Self and child, the sole all-absorbing topics on which the changes are rung, even to weariness. But I suppose one must not heed it, or think the case singular, nor am I afraid must one expect her to improve. I read in a French book lately a sentence to this effect, that marriage might be defined as a state of twofold selfishness. Let the single, therefore, take comfort. Thank you for Mary's letter. She does seem most happy, and I cannot tell you how much more real, lasting, and better warranted her happiness seems than ever did. I think so much of it is in herself and her own serene, pure, trusting, religious nature. Always give me the idea of a vacillating, unsteady rapture, entirely dependent on circumstances, with all their fluctuations. If Mary lives to be a mother, you will then see a greater difference. I wish you, dear E., all health and enjoyment in your visit, and, as far as one can judge at present, there seems a fair prospect of the wish being realized. Yours sincerely, C. Brontë. End of Chapter 10, Part 2. End of Section 14. Section 15 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë, by Elizabeth Gaskell, Volume 2, Section 15, Chapter 11. The reader will remember that Anne Brontë had been interred in the churchyard of the old church at Scarborough. Charlotte had left directions for a tombstone to be placed over her, but many a time during the solitude of the past winter her sad, anxious thoughts had revisited the scene of that last great sorrow, and she had wondered whether all decent services had been rendered to the memory of the dead, until at last she came to a silent resolution to go and see for herself whether the stone and inscription were in a satisfactory state of preservation. Cliff House, Filey, June 6, 1852. Dear E., I am at Filey utterly alone. Do not be angry. The step is right. I considered it and resolved on it with due deliberation. Change of air was necessary. There were reasons why I should not go to the south, and why I should come here. On Friday I went to Scarborough, visited the churchyard and stone. It must be refaced and relettered. There are 5 errors. I gave the necessary directions. That duty, then, is done. Long has it lain heavy on my mind, and that was a pilgrimage I felt I could only make alone. I am in our old lodgings at Mrs. Smith's, not, however, in the same rooms, but in less expensive apartments. They seemed glad to see me, remembered you and me very well, and seemingly with great goodwill. The daughter who used to wait on us is just married. Filey seems to me much altered. More lodging-houses, some of them very handsome, have been built. The sea has all its old grandeur. I walk on the sands a good deal, and try not to feel desolate and melancholy. How sorely my heart longs for you, I need not say. I have bathed once. It seemed to do me good. I may perhaps stay here a fortnight. There are as yet scarcely any visitors. A Lady Wenlock is staying at the large house of which you used so vigilantly to observe the inmates. One day I set out with intent to trudge to Filey Bridge, but was frightened back by 2 cows. I mean to try again some morning. I left papa well. I have been a good deal troubled with headache, and with some pain in the side since I came here, but I feel that this has been owing to the cold wind, for very cold has it been till lately. At present I feel better. Shall I send the papers to you as usual? Write again directly, and tell me this, and anything and everything else, that comes into your mind. Believe me yours faithfully, C. Brontë. Filey, June 16th, 1852. Dear E., be quite easy about me. I really think I am better for my stay at Filey, that I have derived more benefit from it than I dared to anticipate. I believe, could I stay here 2 months, and enjoy something like social cheerfulness, as well as exercise and good air, my health would be quite renewed. This, however, cannot possibly be, but I am most thankful for this good received. I stay here another week. I return letter. I am sorry for her. I believe she suffers, but I do not much like her style of expressing herself. Grief as well as joy manifests itself in most different ways in different people, and I doubt not she is sincere and in earnest when she talks of her precious sainted father, but I could wish she used simpler language. Soon after her return from Filey she was alarmed by a very serious and sharp attack of illness, with which Mr. Brontë was seized. There was some fear for a few days that his sight was permanently lost, and his spirits sank painfully under this dread. "This prostration of spirits," writes his daughter, "which accompanies anything like a relapse, is almost the most difficult point to manage. Dear E., you are tenderly kind in offering your society, but rest very tranquil where you are. Be fully assured that it is not now, nor under present circumstances, that I feel the lack either of society or occupation. My time is pretty well filled up, and my thoughts appropriated. I cannot permit myself to comment much on the chief contents of your last. Advice is not necessary. As far as I can judge, you seem hitherto enabled to take these trials in a good and wise spirit. I can only pray that such combined strength and resignation may be continued to you. Submission, courage, exertion, when practicable, these seem to be the weapons with which we must fight life's long battle." I suppose that during the very time when her thoughts were thus fully occupied with anxiety for her father, she received some letter from her publishers, making inquiry as to the progress of the work which they knew she had in hand. As I find the following letter to Mr. Williams, bearing reference to some of Messrs. Smith and Elder's proposed arrangements. To W. S. Williams, Esq., July 28th, 1852. My dear Sir, is it in contemplation to publish the new edition of Shirley soon? Would it not be better to defer it for a time? In reference to a part of your letter, permit me to express this wish, and I trust in doing so I shall not be regarded as stepping out of my position as an author, and encroaching on the arrangements of business, viz., that no announcement of a new work by the author of Jane Eyre shall be made till the MS. of such work is actually in my publisher's hands. Perhaps we are, none of us, justified in speaking very decidedly where the future is concerned, but for some too much caution in such calculations can scarcely be observed. Amongst this number I must class myself, nor in doing so can I assume an apologetic tone. He does right who does his best. Last autumn I got on for a time quickly. I ventured to look forward to spring as the period of publication. My health gave way. I passed such a winter as, having been once experienced, will never be forgotten. The spring proved little better than a protraction of trial. The warm weather and a visit to the sea have done me much good physically, but as yet I have recovered neither elasticity of animal spirits nor flow of the power of composition. And if it were otherwise, the difference would be of no avail. My time and thoughts are at present taken up with close attendance to my father, whose health is just now in a very critical state, the heat of the weather having produced determination of blood to the head. I am yours sincerely, C. Brontë. Before the end of August, Mr. Brontë's convalescence became quite established, and he was anxious to resume his duties for some time, before his careful daughter would permit him. On September the 14th, the great Duke died. He had been, as we have seen, her hero from childhood, but I find no further reference to him at this time than what is given in the following extract from a letter to her friend. I do hope and believe the changes you have been having this summer will do you permanent good, notwithstanding the pain with which they have been too often mingled. Yet I feel glad that you are soon coming home, and I really must not trust myself to say how much I wish the time were come, when, without let or hindrance, I could once more welcome you to Haworth. But oh, I don't get on. I feel fretted, incapable, sometimes very low. However, at present, the subject must not be dwelt upon. It presses me too hardly, nearly and painfully. Less than ever can I taste or know pleasure till this work is wound up. And yet I often sit up in bed at night, thinking of and wishing for you. Thank you for the Times. What it said on the mighty and mournful subject was well said. All at once the whole nation seems to take a just view of that great character. There was a review, too, of an American book, which I was glad to see. Read Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably, though, you have read it. Papa's health continues satisfactory, thank God. As for me, my wretched liver has been disordered again of late, but I hope it is now going to be on better behaviour. It hinders me in working, depresses both power and tone of feeling. I must expect this derangement from time to time. Haworth was in an unhealthy state, as usual, and both Miss Brontë and Tabby suffered severely from the prevailing epidemics. The former was long in shaking off the effects of this illness. In vain she resolved against allowing herself any society or change of scene until she had accomplished her labour. She was too ill to write, and with illness came on the old heaviness of heart, recollections of the past, and anticipations of the future. At last Mr. Brontë expressed so strong a wish that her friend should be asked to visit her, and she felt some little refreshment so absolutely necessary, that on October the 9th she begged her to come to Haworth, just for a single week. I thought I would persist in denying myself till I had done my work, but I find it won't do. The matter refuses to progress, and this excessive solitude presses too heavily. So let me see your dear face, E., just for one reviving week." But she would only accept of the company of her friend for the exact time specified. She thus writes to Miss Wooler on October the 21st: "E. has only been my companion one little week. I would not have her any longer, for I am disgusted with myself and my delays, and consider it was a weak yielding to temptation in me to send for her at all. But in truth my spirits were getting low, prostrate sometimes, and she has done me inexpressible good. I wonder when I shall see you at Haworth again. Both my father and the servants have again and again insinuated a distinct wish that you should be requested to come in the course of the summer and autumn, but I have always turned rather a deaf ear. Not yet, was my thought. I want first to be free, work first, then pleasure." Miss visit had done her much good. Pleasant companionship during the day produced, for the time, the unusual blessing of calm repose at night; and after her friend's departure she was well enough to fall to business, and write away, almost incessantly, at her story of Villette, now drawing to a conclusion. The following letter to Mr. Smith seems to have accompanied the first part of the MS. October 30th, 1852. "My dear Sir, you must notify honestly what you think of Villette when you have read it. I can hardly tell you how I hunger to see some opinion besides my own, and how I have sometimes desponded, and almost despaired, because there was no one to whom to read a line, or to whom to ask a counsel. Jane Eyre was not written under such circumstances, nor were two-thirds of Shirley. I got so miserable about it, I could bear no allusion to the book. It is not finished yet, but now I hope. As to the anonymous publication, I have this to say. If the withholding of the author's name should tend materially to injure the publisher's interest, to interfere with booksellers' orders, etc., I would not press the point. But if no such detriment is contingent, I should be most thankful for the sheltering shadow of an incognito. I seem to dread the advertisements, the large-lettered Currer Bell's new novel, or new work by the author of Jane Eyre. These, however, I feel well enough, are the transcendentalisms of a retired wretch. So you must speak frankly. I shall be glad to see Colonel Esmond. My objection to the second volume lay here. I thought it contained decidedly too much history, too little story. In another letter referring to Esmond, she uses the following words: "The third volume seemed to me to possess the most sparkle, impetus, and interest. Of the first and second, my judgment was that parts of them were admirable, but there was the fault of containing too much history, too little story. I hold that a work of fiction ought to be a work of creation, that the real should be sparingly introduced in pages dedicated to the ideal. Plain household bread is a far more wholesome and necessary thing than cake, yet who would like to see the brown loaf placed on the table for dessert? In the second volume the author gives us an ample supply of excellent brown bread; in his third, only such a portion as gives substance, like the crumbs of bread in a well-made, not too rich, plum pudding." Her letter to Mr. Smith, containing the allusion to Esmond, which reminded me of the quotation just given, continues: "You will see that 'Villette' touches on no matter of public interest. I cannot write books handling the topics of the day. It is of no use trying. Nor can I write a book for its moral. Nor can I take up a philanthropic scheme, though I honour philanthropy, and voluntarily and sincerely veil my face before such a mighty subject as that handled in Mrs. Beecherstow's work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. To manage these great matters rightly, they must be long and practically studied, their bearings known intimately, and their evils felt genuinely. They must not be taken up as a business matter, and a trading speculation. I doubt not Mrs. Stowe had felt the iron of slavery enter into her heart from childhood upwards, long before she ever thought of writing books. The feeling throughout her work is sincere, and not got up. Remember to be an honest critic of 'Villette,' and tell Mr. Williams to be unsparing. Not that I am likely to alter anything, but I want to know his impressions and yours. To G. Smith, Esquire, November 3rd. My dear Sir, I feel very grateful for your letter. It relieved me much, for I was a good deal harassed by doubts as to how 'Villette' might appear in others' eyes than my own. I feel in some degree authorized to rely on your favourable impressions, because you are quite right where you hint disapprobation. You have exactly hit 2 points at least where I was conscious of defect: the discrepancy, the want of perfect harmony, between Graham's boyhood and manhood, the angular abruptness of his change of sentiment towards Miss Fanshawe. You must remember, though, that in secret he had for some time appreciated that young lady at a somewhat depressed standard, held her a little lower than the angels. But still the reader ought to have been better made to feel this preparation towards a change of mood. As to the publishing arrangement, I leave them to Cornhill. There is undoubtedly a certain force in what you say about the expediency of effecting a mystery which cannot be sustained. So you must act as you think is for the best. I submit also to the advertisements in large letters, but under protest, and with a kind of ostrich longing for concealment. Most of the third volume is given to the development of the crabbed professor's character. Lucy must not marry Dr. John. He is far too youthful, handsome, bright-spirited, and sweet-tempered. He is a curled darling of nature and of fortune, and must draw a prize in life's lottery. His wife must be young, rich, pretty. He must be made very happy indeed. If Lucy marries anybody, it must be the Professor, a man in whom there is much to forgive, much to put up with. But I am not leniently disposed towards Miss Frost from the beginning. I never meant to appoint her lines in pleasant places. The conclusion of this third volume is still a matter of some anxiety. I can but do my best, however. It would speedily be finished, could I ward off certain obnoxious headaches, which, whenever I get into the spirit of my work, are apt to seize and prostrate me. Colonel Henry Esmond is just arrived. He looks very antique and distinguished in his Queen Anne's garb. The periwig, sword, lace, and ruffles are very well represented by the old Spectator type. In reference to a sentence towards the close of this letter, I may mention what she told me, that Mr. Brontë was anxious that her new tale should end well, as he disliked novels which left a melancholy impression upon the mind, and he requested her to make her hero and heroine, like the heroes and heroines in fairy tales, marry and live very happily ever after. But the idea of Mr. Paul Emanuel's death at sea was stamped on her imagination, till it assumed the distinct force of reality, and she could no more alter her fictitious ending than if they had been facts which she was relating. All she could do, in compliance with her father's wish, was to veil the fate in oracular words, as to leave it to the character and discernment of her readers to interpret her meaning. To W. S. Williams, Esquire. November 6th, 1852. My dear Sir, I must not delay thanking you for your kind letter, with its candid and able commentary on Villette. With many of your strictures I concur. The third volume may, perhaps, do away with some of the objections. Others still remain in force. I do not think the interest culminates anywhere to the degree you would wish. What climax there is, does not come on till near the conclusion, and even then, I doubt whether the regular novel reader will consider the agony piled sufficiently high, as the Americans say, or the colours dashed on to the canvas with the proper amount of daring. Still, I fear they must be satisfied with what is offered. My palette affords no brighter tints. Were I to attempt to deepen the reds, or burnish the yellows, I should but botch. Unless I am mistaken, the emotion of the book will be found to be kept throughout in tolerable subjection. As to the name of the heroine, I can hardly express what subtlety of thought made me decide upon giving her a cold name, but at first I called her Lucy Snowe, spelt with an E, which Snow I afterwards changed to Frost. Subsequently I rather regretted the change, and wished it Snow again. If not too late, I should like the alteration to be made now throughout the MS. A cold name she must have, partly perhaps on the lucus a non lucendo principle, partly on that of the fitness of things, for she has about her an external coldness. You say that she may be thought morbid and weak, unless the history of her life be more fully given. I consider that she is both morbid and weak at times. Her character sets up no pretensions to unmixed strength, and anybody living her life would necessarily become morbid. It was no impetus of healthy feeling which urged her to the confessional, for instance. It was the semi-delirium of solitary grief and sickness. If, however, the book does not express all this, there must be a great fault somewhere. I might explain away a few other points, but it would be too much like drawing a picture, and then writing underneath the name of the object intended to be represented. We know what sort of a pencil that is which needs an ally in the pen. Thanking you again for the clearness and fullness with which you have responded to my request for a statement of impressions, I am, my dear sir, yours very sincerely, C. Brontë. I trust the work will be seen in MS. by no one except Mr. Smith and yourself. November 10th, 1852. My dear Sir, I only wish the publication of "Shirley" to be delayed till "Villette" was nearly ready, so that there can now be no objection to its being issued whenever you think fit. About putting the MS. into type, I can only say that, should I be able to proceed with the third volume at my average rate of composition, and with no more than the average amount of interruptions, I should hope to have it ready in about 3 weeks. I leave it to you to decide whether it would be better to delay the printing that space of time, or to commence it immediately. It would certainly be more satisfactory if you were to see the third volume before printing the first and the second; yet, if delay is likely to prove injurious, I do not think it is indispensable. I have read the third volume of Esmond. I found it both entertaining and exciting to me. It seems to possess an impetus and excitement beyond the other two. That movement and brilliancy its predecessors sometimes wanted, never fails here. In certain passages I thought Thackeray used all his powers. Their grand, serious force yielded a profound satisfaction. At last he put forth his strength, I could not help saying to myself. No character in the book strikes me as more masterly than that of Beatrix. Its conception is fresh, and its delineation vivid. It is peculiar, it has impressions of a new kind, new at least to me. Beatrix is not, in herself, all bad; so much does she sometimes reveal of what is good and great as to suggest this feeling. You would think she was urged by a fate. You would think that some antique doom presses on her house, and that once in so many generations its brightest ornament was to become its greatest disgrace. At times, what is good in her struggles against this terrible destiny, but the fate conquers. Beatrix cannot be an honest woman and a good man's wife. She tries, and she cannot. Proud, beautiful, and sullied, she was born what she becomes, a king's mistress. I know not whether you have seen the notice in the Leader. I read it just after concluding the book. Can I be wrong in deeming it a notice tame, cold, and insufficient? With all its professed friendliness, it produced on me a most disheartening impression. Surely another sort of justice than this will be rendered to Esmond from other quarters. One acute remark of the critic is to the effect that Blanche, Amory, and Beatrix are identical, sketched from the same original. To me they are about as identical as a weasel and a royal tigress of Bengal. Both the latter are quadrupeds, both the former women, but I must not take up either your time or my own with further remarks. Believe me yours sincerely, C. Brontë. On a Saturday, a little later in this month, Miss Brontë completed "Villette," and sent it off to her publishers. I said my prayers when I had done it. Whether it is well or ill done, I don't know. D.V., I will now try and wait the issue quietly. The book, I think, will not be considered pretentious, nor is it out of character to excite hostility. As her labour was ended, she felt at liberty to allow herself a little change. There were several friends anxious to see her, and welcome her to their homes, Miss Martineau, Mrs. Smith, and her own faithful E. With the last, in the same letter as that in which she announced the completion of "Villette," she offered to spend a week. She began also to consider whether it might not be well to avail herself of Mrs. Smith's kind invitation, with a view to the convenience of being on the spot to correct the proofs. The following letter is given, not merely on account of her own criticisms on "Villette," but because it shows how she had learned to magnify the meaning of trifles, as all do who live a self-contained and solitary life. Mr. Smith had been unable to write by the same post as that which brought the money for "Villette," and she consequently received it without a line. The friend with whom she was staying says that she immediately fancied there was some disappointment about "Villette," or that some word or act of hers had given offence, and had not the Sunday intervened, and so allowed time for Mr. Smith's letter to make its appearance, she would certainly have crossed it on her way to London. December 6th, 1852. My dear Sir, the receipts have reached me safely. I received the first on Saturday, enclosed in a cover without a line, and had made up my mind to take the train on Monday, and go up to London to see what was the matter, and what had struck my publisher mute. On Sunday morning your letter came, and you have thus been spared the visitation of the unannounced and unsummoned apparition of Currer Bell in Cornhill. Inexplicable delays should be avoided when possible, for they are apt to urge those subjected to their harassment to sudden and impulsive steps. I must pronounce you right again, in your complaint of the transfer of interest in the third volume, from one set of characters to another. It is not pleasant, and it will probably be found as unwelcome to the reader as it was, in a sense, compulsory upon the writer. The spirit of romance would have indicated another course, far more flowery and inviting. It would have fashioned a paramount hero, kept faithfully with him, and made him supremely worshipful. He should have been an idol, and not a mute, unresponding idol either, but this would have been unlike real life, inconsistent with truth, at variance with probability. I greatly apprehend, however, that the weakest character in the book is the one I aimed at making the most beautiful; and if this be the case, the fault lies in its wanting the germ of the real, in its being purely imaginary. I felt that this character lacked substance. I fear that the reader will feel the same. Union with it resembles too much the fate of Ixion, who was mated with a cloud. The childhood of Paulina is, however, I think, pretty well imagined, but her The remainder of this interesting sentence is torn off the letter. A brief visit to London becomes the most practicable, and if your mother will kindly write, when she has time, and name a day after Christmas which will suit her, I shall have pleasure, papa's health permitting, in availing myself of her invitation. I wish I could come in time to correct some at least of the proofs. It would save trouble. End of Section 15.